Really delighted to welcome Doug Lemov here to reflect on online learning and some of the lessons that we can take from the several periods of lockdown that we've experienced and the remote and hybrid learning models that we've been undertaking over the last year or so. Just a bit of context for the King's Leadership Academy. We are one of the leading demonstrator schools as part of the EdTech Demonstrator program. And we've been proud to work over the last 12 months with over 100 schools in supporting their remote learning provision from a variety of different contexts through to Google Classroom and their Zoom participation to just general systems that has helped them to move their remote learning on from where it began. We've also got Ty Goddard here with us this afternoon, who's one of the national leads for the EdTech Demonstrator program. And just to give you a bit of an idea of the schedule this afternoon, I'm going to hand over shortly to Doug, who's going to lead the webinar. He has said that he's more than happy for people to share questions and thoughts, and we have got a bit of time at the end, 15 minutes or so, to ask Doug some questions. And then Ty Goddard will close the webinar and bring together the context for the webinar and how we've managed to bring together the 7th webinar where we've had some leading sort of educationalists sharing their reflections on online learning. Just a bit of context as well, I'm in the school hall and I've got approximately around about 50 to 60 of our King's leadership staff with us. So Doug, they may have a few questions for you at the end too. So I'm going to hand over to you now.
Brilliant, thank you. It's nice to be connected to everyone, even if remotely, and to have the chance to talk about the most important work in society, which is teaching. And hopefully we're now coming out of what has surely been the most difficult period of teaching in our generation. And so part of what I want to take a minute to talk about is just some of the lessons that we might have learned from that experience, or that I might offer from that experience. One of those lessons is that teaching is teaching, and the fundamentals of it apply whether we're doing it in a classroom or on a laptop. But I think we can go a bit further than that. So here's some initial thoughts at that question, things we've learned. And I think one of the things that we've learned a bit about is the importance of norms. When we enter a new context, suddenly norms become more evident to us and more visible to us. The norms that we take for granted, we don't have around us. And so in a new context, new norms develop. Here's a quick photograph comparing 2 different norms for the new context of online learning. On the left is a class. This is actually from a class that I'll show you video of in a minute. It's the teacher in the upper left-hand corner and all of her students. And you can see that they can see each other and she can see them. And on the right is a video taken from another classroom where students can't see one another. And to me, this is one of the most important realizations of the online world, which is if you're in the classroom on the right and you can't see how people react to you and whether people value your ideas when you participate, you're very unlikely to make a thoughtful and honest and forthright comment in class. And so that norm, are our cameras on, are our cameras off, deeply shapes the interactions that happen in the classroom. So in any new environment, the de facto norm, what happens naturally, will not be the ideal norm. And we maybe have realized again online how important it is to engineer norms, to build the right norms that cause the best learning environment for our students, and then to make everyone feel a part of it so that everyone feels connected to that norm. So as I like to do whenever I can, I'd like to make that case by showing you some video. So I'm going to show you a video of a teacher. This is Ariana Chop. She is a year 6 English teacher in Los Angeles. And would love to invite you to chat while you watch this video with observations about how you perceive Ariana to be setting norms for her class. This is the beginning of class, it's the beginning of the class period. It's the first couple minutes of her instruction, but it also happened fairly early during lockdown. And so you could say that it's the beginning of class in other ways as well. So just give me a second here to just switch my screen and make sure I got the sound going here. So here's Ariana. The question is, how do you perceive her to be setting norms for her class? And I encourage you to share your observations in the chat. Here we go.
All right, here we go. Please open up your class novel, whether you have the PDF or you have the hard copy. Thank you so much, Caleb, for putting your name, date, and advisory on this. Mercedes is already ready to go. Jasmine, can you unmute yourself, please, and read our reading focus?
Reading focus. As we read the conclusion of Esperanza Rising, Chapter 8, we will focus on characterization of Esperanza.
Thank you so much. And so as we remember what we've been talking about with Esperanza, how is she becoming a dynamic character, a character who is changing? Please take 1 minute and write it in the comments. How is Esperanza changing? Please put it in the comments. Love the hands that are already happening though with Josiah, Michelle, and Natalia. 50 seconds. Anna, make sure you're typing. Thank you, Michelle. Kate and Josiah have a response. 30 seconds. Caleb, can you be more specific? I do agree she is changing in California, but how? Love your response, Byron. Thank you, Zaire. Still waiting on 10 students. Great, go ahead and read your response and then get ready to use habits of discussion, and you can feel free to add on. Please start our conversation off, Caleb, Freddie, and then Josiah.
She's changing because ever since she went to California, she's been changing. And I know why, because she's rich in Mexico, but she's changed because she's meeting poor people in California.
Add on to that, Freddie.
Caleb, I somewhat agree with you, and I like to add on. It's not because she moved to California. Is that when she was moving, she had bad manners before.
Great, so we'll leave Freddie there, sharing his initial thoughts. And we'd just love to ask, a couple of people have already started chatting. Thank you for that. We'd love just to encourage you to chat one observation. How do you see Ariana building norms here? Great. See lots of thoughts coming in. I'll just give you a couple seconds to get those thoughts in. Yeah, just to pick up on something that Christina just put in there, she thanks the students who respond quickly. As soon as students do the things that she would like them to do, she lets them know that she sees them and that she values their participation. And so she's trying to build a culture of active participation, as opposed to passivity, which can be the norm online. Yeah, and the names really help so students feel it individually. Yeah, I see a couple people have put the word accountability in there. She cold calls. Jasmine is the first student that she calls on, and then she cold calls 3 students in a row and asks them to jump in on the conversation. And so if you're in her class, you know right away that you could be invited into a real conversation at any time. A couple people also, I love your point, Carolyn Green, about time-bound tasks to keep momentum, motivation, and engagement. I think one of the most powerful lessons of online learning is the power of flow, which is when students lose themselves in an activity that has energy and momentum, and they feel deeply involved in something, they're happy and they feel meaning and connection. And so the fact that part of the way that she builds connections with her students is actually by just getting started right away and building this level of energy and dynamism in her class. And yes, Melissa, thank you for that point. Using the phrase habits of discussion encourages students to participate not just by talking or by chatting, but by listening to each other as well. And those things are also really important. Lots and lots of great comments coming into the chat. Thank you for that. I appreciate it so much. Here, just to recap a couple of ways that you might say that Ariana is building norms. She starts right away with a cold call, which sets the expectation that that everyone will be involved. It's going to be active, and that applies to everyone. And that it's loving accountability, but it's also inclusiveness. I have a colleague here, Colleen Driggs, who many of you may know as one of the co-author of Reading Reconsidered. And she has a daughter who's a year 3 student. And she was really, really struggling, her daughter, with online instruction and really hated school and would cry every night about it. Until there was a day when her teacher cold called her and she said, "Gee, Maggie, what do you think?" And suddenly it felt to Maggie like she was a part of something, like her teacher could see her and she was important. And so the cold call there is really a form of inclusiveness. That maybe the most important takeaway from this is just that within 1 minute of this lesson starting, everyone is actively involved in a task, and then she narrates it back to everyone, back to the rest of the class, so they can see that everyone is involved and they feel her appreciation for their involvement. And so she is building a norm of active participation right from the outset, very intentionally, so that when her students log into her class, they come to expect, I will be actively involved. I'll be engaged throughout. My best thinking will be required of me. I will be a part of a community. And I think those things are important online, but also when we come back to classrooms. Again, we can see, there are students who also interpret the norm of passivity in our bricks and mortar classrooms. And so learning that lesson from online learning, where there's a where there's a premium, and where if we don't engage students right away, we risk losing them, is a great and powerful lesson. I want to show you another video, just because for a little bit of theme and variation reasons. This is Denise Karate. She's a math teacher, but her approach is both similar and different. And so I'd love to ask you what you see here, what's consistent in what Denise does in opening her class, and what's different, what's new. And again, I'll ask you to chat a little bit, some of your observations, and I may show this video actually in 2 parts. So give me 1 second just to get my video rolling here. Oops. Okay. And here is Denise.
Peyton's here. Hi, Peyton. Oh, and Camden's here too now. Hi, Cam. All right, do you all see my screen? So you will need paper and pencil or pen today, and definitely a positive attitude. So the 3 Ps, I'll give you folks a minute to get that if you don't already have it. So go, 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 and come on back. All right. Okay, so expectations, because it's a distance learning situation, it's a little different than what we do in class. So please stay muted unless you get called on. If you do have questions, you can type them in the chat because I can see that on my iPad screen. Or if you have a question that you don't want to ask in front of everybody, that's totally okay too. You guys can send me an email. A lot of you have been doing that. And for today, I would really love to see your faces. So if you could show your face on screen, that would be really great. It's okay if your hair's not brushed. That's totally fine. Okay, shall we move on then?
In a second, I'm going to show you the rest of Denise's video, but I just thought even before her teaching, I'd love to see if anyone saw anything there that they think is valuable in terms of building norms. So go ahead and please chat if you have observations about what you've seen just so far about Denise's online lesson. Yeah. Several people mentioning her greeting students by name and making them feel a part of something. It's interesting though, she greets them very quickly and then gets down to it. Someone just, I'm sorry, I didn't see who said this, humor and positive attitude. I think this, her graciousness and her playfulness are really lovely because she's using them to set expectations, right? I mentioned before how important it was to have cameras on. And I think that a lot of teachers, it's hard to ask students for cameras on, but she does it in this loving and playful and warm way. And it just reminds us that you can do the hard stuff lovingly. And in fact, doing the hard stuff lovingly is a great way to cause it to happen. Yes, and a beautiful word for her tone there is reassuring and encouraging. Great. Just looking at some of the other comments coming in. Yes, her positivity really sings there. One other thing that she does is she explains to students how they can participate. If you have questions, you can email them to me. You can send them in the chat. And this is a theme that I'm going to come back to, just explicitness about how to participate and how to engage in class is another thing that we maybe overlook in bricks and mortar classrooms where we think that the norms are all understood. But before I get into that, I want to show you the second half of Denise's class, because this is where she actually starts teaching. And this part is lovely and instructive also. So here's the rest of Denise's video.
So today I want to start off with a weight question. A weight question means I'm going to ask you the question and you'll type your answer into the chat, but don't press enter until I tell you to. So that way nobody sees each other's answer until I say. Does that make sense? Give me a thumbs up if you understand. Okay, cool. So today, since we're talking about percents, I just want you to think about what do you already know about percents? Okay, what do you already know about percents? And then I'll give you folks again another minute and you can type in the chat, but don't forget, don't press enter until I tell you to. Everybody good? Thumbs up if you understand. Awesome. Okay, 1 minute. Ready? Go. About 10 more seconds. All right. Now go ahead and everybody press enter. And now you can go ahead and start reading what your classmates have posted. See if anyone wrote the same idea as you. See if there are other ideas that were shared that you maybe forgot about. Oh, yes, Peyton, percent is always something out of 100. Great. Oh, Taylor said that too. So did Tori. Okay, percents meaning it's part of something. Nice, Carly. Yes, you can definitely apply the different operations to percents, Kaylee. Awesome.
Okay, and if you wouldn't mind, again, back to the chat. I'd love to see your observations on this, hear your observations on the second half of Denise's clip. What would you like here? And maybe specifically, what could you apply, whether you're online or in a bricks and mortar classroom? Great. Yeah, the weight question really carefully designed there to slow students down, cause them to think a little bit. She does use the thumbs up to make sure that everyone understands the task. One of the big challenges of online learning is that it's so easy for students to misunderstand tasks because they can't look at what their peers are doing to solve, to figure it out when they don't understand the directions themselves. And so if nothing else, perhaps it's taught us to be clearer and both visual and verbal about our directions. Yeah, great. Yeah, Trish, I love your point. Especially in math, I like the idea of having everyone wait to prevent the same students answering first all the time, right? If we make it a race, we know that some students will decide they can't be the fastest and therefore will give up from participating. And so wait time is really important. And she's thought about that and she's engineered the way that she wants students to participate around it to be inclusive so all students can participate. Yeah, and as Christina is pointing out, students not hitting enter straight away means they have a little thinking space to give their response, right? She's socializing deeper thinking. Again, if we don't put systems like that in place, it's very easy for answering to become a race. And if it's a race, we're not going to get students' best thinking. And that's our fault if we let it happen. So here are a couple of points about Denise's lesson that I was thinking about. The first is just this point of her design of a weight question. She is both intentional about how she wants students to participate and transparent, right? She explains to them how I want you to participate so they know how to do it right. And they know that she wants them to think and to think for themselves. And that's really important. And again, a lesson that we'll come back to that can apply in the bricks and mortar classroom. And then one other point, I think she's great about confirming that students are with her. Give me a thumbs up if you understand. She engages students right away. In the first 2 minutes, everyone is involved and she narrates back to them, I see you, I value, I appreciate it when you're involved. And so she's making the norm active engagement. And that's very similar to what Ariana does. And just the way that Ariana cold calls 3 students and asks them to listen to each other, Denise too values listening as one of the most important forms of participation in class. We often think of talking as the most important form of participation. But Denise says, go ahead and start reading. See if anyone wrote the same idea as you. Any shares that you forgot about. And so for her, once you've chatted, you're not done. The listening part is as important as the talking part. And that's an important lesson as well. So a couple of themes maybe across these 2 videos that I've shown is they're warm and gracious, but they get started quickly and give students something to lose themselves into and be involved in, so they feel a part of something. I have several daughters who are in school, and one of my daughters has a teacher who I overhear in online teaching, greeting every student by name at the beginning of class and asking them about their weekend. And I know she's doing it to build relationships, but it has the opposite effect on my daughter, who wants to know that her time is valued and that she's logged in for a reason and that she's going to be engaged in a productive and meaningful activity. And so generally the first, and so finally the first norm here among these 2 classes is you will be active and you will be engaged, and it comes from the first 2 minutes. And that's important because especially on screen, but also in the classroom, norms of passivity, expectation that this is what we do here, we all wait to see if anyone else is going to raise their hand first, can easily emerge both online and in the classroom. And returning to the classroom actually might let us glimpse how easy it is for students to think this is the kind of environment where I put my head down and it's easy for me to check out. Paps McRae makes a great point in his book, Motivated Teaching, which I love, by the way. And if you like to read about education, I think this is one of the best books out there that you could read. Social norms shape our motivation. In other words, people do what they do because they see others around them doing it, which is why it's so important for Ariana and Denise to make the norms visible to other students by calling them out. But the strength of their influence, Pep says, depends on how much we feel a part of those norms. And so students need to feel included and meaningful and a part of the community. They need to be seen and see their classmates. So again, when students are doing positive things, both of these teachers are saying, I see you, I value it, it's important to me. Cameras on has perhaps been the most challenging part. And so, to the degree that it's still useful and that you're still teaching online, some of our guidance around getting cameras on is, even if you can't require it, you can ask students to put their cameras on and follow up and say, David, I see your camera wasn't on today. I think you'll be much happier. You'll get so much more out of it if your camera is on, with both kids and parents. And we can be persistent and tell students that it matters and it has meaning and that we want them to do it. And if they say no, or if they resist the first time, because of course some students do that we don't give up and we do the hard work of pushing them. And then the second thing I think that we're seeing in these videos is rewarding cameras on by making students feel a part of something, seen, important, that's the loving and loving accountability. And so one of the important parts of that is that you will be happier as a teacher if you enforce those things. And the reason I mention that is because it reminds me of a story that I think is one of the most telling lessons, that gets to one of the most telling lessons about online teaching that also applies to in-person teaching. And it comes from Dan Ariely's book about behavioral economics, which is called Predictably Irrational. And it starts with a story about Bandaids and bandages. And it turns out that there is a generally accepted folk wisdom about the removal of bandages. And it goes something like this, which is ripping off bandages quickly, removing them very quickly, is better for the patient because there's less net overall discomfort and pain for patients. And Ariely describes this, and it's actually something that he feels very strongly about, because as a young man, he was a burn victim, and he spent a lot of time in the hospital having his bandages removed quickly. And I guess he developed strong feelings about this because he was skeptical about it, skeptical enough that when he became a practicing psychologist, he tested it by actually having bandages removed different ways from patients and measuring their total discomfort. And his conclusion was pretty overwhelming, which is that the conventional wisdom was wrong. and that the fast removal of bandages did not result in less net discomfort, and that slow removal of bandages was preferable for patients. And so he then went back to the hospital where he had been a patient all those years and told the nurses about it with this sense of like excitement and expectation of, guess what? I've tested it. You should remove bandages more slowly. But the interesting thing is that when he went back, the nurses did not change their behavior. They kept removing bandages quickly, and they stayed with their sort of norm of practice. I just want to ask you now in the chat, out of curiosity, why do you think the nurses didn't change their behavior? Just curious to see what your sense for why they might have resisted the data. Curious to see how you might interpret it. Go ahead and feel free to chat now. Yes, I think that is true, Lisa, that the routine is deeply embedded, and once we're embedded in a habit, as Darren is also pointing out, we don't always want to change it. Oh, and interesting, Rachel pointing out, sometimes it's just hard to admit that you're wrong. There's fear of change. They perceive themselves to be experts. Yes. Yeah, these are great points. And also, Trish, your point is great, which is a bit like being a teacher. Sometimes you're just in a hurry and there isn't time to slow down to do things in the optimal way. But interestingly, what the nurses told Ariely was something different. What it turns out, the reason that they didn't want to remove the bandages slowly was because it was awful for them. Because removing bandages slowly caused them to acknowledge that they were inflicting discomfort on patients, and it drew it out and it made it more visible to them. And so really what had happened was this myth of fast bandage removal had emerged because it helped mitigate the discomfort of the caregiver. And so this helps us define something that's relatively important in healthcare and in education, which I'm just going to call the Band-Aid paradox, which is caregivers' anxiety about treatment can cause them to choose a suboptimal form of treatment. That is, I choose to remove bandages quickly instead of slowly, and explain it via an argument apparently grounded in patient's interest. The patients feel less pain, but that's not, in fact, what happens. It's that it's less stressful and less anxiety-inducing for the nurses themselves. And that is one of the primary reasons beyond the ones that you all identified why nurses struggle to change, which is to give optimal care forces them to take the risk of doing something that's hard and difficult and psychologically challenging. And this happens all the time in education. For example, asking pupils to turn their cameras on is a really challenging thing to do that causes us psychological discomfort, and we have to worry about whether they'll actually turn their cameras on. And so it's much easier to create an argument that says it's an invasion of their space and it's insensitive from an equity perspective, and students may be embarrassed by what's revealed on their cameras, and sort of walk by the fact that students are perfectly capable of turning their camera to the wall if there's something that would be revealed that they might be embarrassed about. So I would argue that this is a case in part of the difficulty of the move from a caregiver standpoint psychologically causes us to resist doing it and to create a rationalization grounded in the patient's interest. And the interesting thing is some data has started to come out about the cost of not having cameras on in online instruction. I'll just summarize this data very quickly because we're a little bit tight for time, but this is a study by an organization called Zern Math, and they assess students, they do maths assessment across classrooms, and they compared the standard deviation of student achievement in classrooms in the US this calendar year, this school year versus last school year. And by that, I mean, what is the total amount of variation between the top performing students and the bottom performing students in any classroom? And what they found is that at the top, the two green bars, is that if students had been in all or mostly in-person classrooms, the amount of variance between the top students and the bottom students didn't change very much. In fact, it reduced slightly this year versus last year. But if students had been in mostly virtual or all virtual classrooms, the amount of variation between the top students and the bottom students increased astronomically, increased by 100% in the case of all virtual learning. And for high poverty settings, the effect was even more demonstrative. And so so the difficulty of asking students to put their cameras on and persisting and following up and doing all that difficult psychological work caused teachers in this country, in my country at least, to allow suboptimal treatment in a way that's quite profound. And so it just reminds us of there are other ways that this shows up. And one of them, I think, is cold calling, which is psychologically challenging for teachers to do sometimes, but has a tremendously positive effect on students. And one of my favorite videos from the pandemic year is this one that I'm just going to show you right here, of a teacher named Nikki Hernandez. Just give me one moment to get my video rolling. And I'm just going to pause it at one moment because I think it's quite telling. This is Nikki starting her Spanish class.
Let's get started. So we're going to go through everything in Spanish, just like we always do in class. So here we go. La primera cosa, chicos, es que necesitamos llegar preparados para la clase. Así que la pregunta es, ¿qué necesito para la clase hoy? Okay, Abby, what does this question say?
Well, there's Abby right below Nikki getting cold called, and you can see she smiles when she gets cold called, which I think is interesting because we presume that students won't want to be cold called, but actually she's perfectly fine with it, and she's okay. And in fact, it makes her feel like suddenly she's a part of the class. And so I just think that this is a case where something that's difficult to do, we may resist it, we may see it as pulling off Bandaids slowly, but actually when we do it well, it's quite doable. And in fact, the research, a bit of new research on cold calling has just come out that I think is really fascinating. And what it points out is that not only do students participate more when they're cold called, but after they are cold called, they participate more because they're much more likely to volunteer afterwards. In other words, once you break the ice with a student and you make them see that they can participate and it's fine and that they can do it successfully, they then start raising their hands and they start feeling more positive about classroom participation and classroom discussions. And so it just reminds us that when we can make students feel a part of the norms, then they're more likely to join into them. I think relationships have been another thing that we've learned a lot about in the course of online learning. And we all know that relationships are central to the classroom. And I think one of the great books on relationships that you might take a look at is Adeyemi Stenbridge's book, Culturally Responsive Education in the Classroom. And he offers this triangle, which is he doesn't conceive of relationships as something exclusively between teachers and students. He considers it a triangle in which the goal is really for students to develop relationships to content. In other words, the purpose of our relationship with students is not to make ourselves happy and to make students love us, though it's nice if that's an outcome, an ancillary outcome, but the purpose is for them to build a relationship to the content, to the subject of their learning, partly by our making it feel meaningful and important to them. So yes, relationships matter, but the purpose is to build relationships between students and content. And the peer-to-peer culture you engineer is at least as strong a force in building a sense of belonging as is our direct relationship with students. So a way of thinking about this might be you call on a student in class, or let's even say it's not a cold call, she raises her hand. Let's say her name is Asia. It's a biology class. She has wondered whether she could keep up in biology and whether she's the kind of student who can make it in the sciences. But in the course of your class, she's gotten more and more interested in DNA recombination and topics like that. And suddenly she raises her hand because she has a thought, and she suddenly wants to share it. And she's wondering, is this thought any good? Is this should I say this? Is it okay? And one of the things that will communicate to her that she can make it in biology and that she can aspire to the biological sciences is the reaction of her peers. If when she raises her hand, students are looking at her and nodding and seem interested in her idea, and maybe the next person who participates refers back to her idea and suggests that it matters in the same way that we saw the students doing in Ariana's classroom at the beginning, that tells her that that influences her profoundly in her conception of herself. Versus if she makes that comment in a classroom and the body language of the students around her says, I don't give a damn what you just said, and they're slouched and they're looking out the window, and the next comment doesn't even acknowledge that she had spoken, or there is no next comment and her words hang in the air. That tells it that may be the last time that a student volunteers in class and believes that she can make it and her thoughts are relevant. And so there, does it matter whether her teacher is encouraging and says, oh, thank you so much for making that point, Asia? Yes, what her teacher says matters, but not nearly as much as what her peers signal. And so peer-to-peer interactions in the classrooms are some of the norms that we set, and they're deeply and abidingly important to student progress, possibly, though it's hard for us to acknowledge this, possibly more important than teacher-student relationships. To the degree that teacher-student relationships are important, one of the most important ways to build that relationship is to teach someone well, to involve them in something. And so building a relationship by making someone feel important and worthy of instruction and getting moving with, and helping them feel successful in the classroom. I feel like that's critical as well. And you could see that happening in Denise's classroom and Ariana's classroom. This is from some research by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who says the best moments in our lives, this is from his research on the concept of flow, are not the passive, receptive, relaxing times. The best moments usually occur if a person's body or mind is stretched to its limits in a voluntary effort to accomplish something difficult and worthwhile. And so this idea of flow is the moments when you're completely absorbed in a challenging but doable task. And so I think my argument is that that's what you see. Oh my gosh, can you not see my screen right now? Here I am yammering on. Thank you so much for making that point. I'm not sharing my screen. Ha. Sorry, this quote is from Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who's the foremost research on this idea of flow. And he says, the best moments of our lives are not the passive, receptive, relaxing times. The best moments usually occur if a person's body or mind is stretched to its limits in a voluntary effort to accomplish something difficult and worthwhile. So flow is the moments when you're completely absorbed in a task, and that is when people often feel the most happiness and the most meaning. And I think that you can see that happening in the two videos that we've shown. Those are lessons that instantly sweep students up in intentional, productive activity around learning. And that, in the end, is what communicates joy in learning as much as anything else that happens around that. And that's something that we have to bring back to the classroom and engineer our classrooms around to create a sense of flow and dynamism. And so one of the steps to doing that, I think, is thinking about how we prepare for lessons a little bit differently. And one of my biggest takeaways from this year has been the difference between lesson planning and lesson preparation. Lesson planning, I would say, is deciding what activities students will do, what questions they will answer, and what content they will engage with. Lesson preparation is asking questions like, how will they engage the content? Will I ask them questions? If so, will I ask them a wait question, or will it be a chat question where they answer right away? Will I ask them to answer in writing? Will I cold call them? If I give them wait time, how much wait time will I give them? And those are lesson preparation decisions. And you can see here that, look, one of the things that I use when I present online is a series of icons to remind myself of what move I wanted to use from a participation standpoint. One, because if I put it into my notes to myself or onto my slides, then I can remember it without having to try to think about it in the moment, and it frees my working memory. But it also causes me to plan them out in advance and decide when in the flow of my lessons do I want to engage people in different ways. And you could actually do the same thing in class. And so here, this is my icon for cold call and for wait time and for everybody writes, which is just letting everyone write a response for a minute on their paper or turn and talk. And here's just an example of what this might look like, either in preparation for an online lesson or for a bricks and mortar lesson. This is a teacher. You can see her lesson plan is the printed materials, but the lesson preparation is written in her handwriting here. You can see she's starting with a Zoom poll into a cold call, then write me a message if you're with the answer if you're done early. Or up here, she's doing a speed question, which is a form of chat. And so part of her preparation process is thinking about how students will engage in the lesson. And she's actually part of a school that has standardized these icons. So you can see they use these icons in their lesson preparation process to remind themselves which form of participation they want to use at any given time. So they're intentional about it and intentional about engaging students in the lesson. So there's a sense of dynamism and flow. And I know that they will take this back to they've been using these in online lessons, but they will take them back to their bricks and mortar classrooms as well, and hopefully result in much more dynamic and powerful lessons. I want to show you one more video before we wrap and I give some time for questions. And this one's going to be a strange one because it's not from a classroom. It's from a football training session. But I think that this coach is a brilliant teacher. And he does a really great job of a concept that I call means of participation, which is going to be one of the new techniques in Teach Like a Champion 3.0. And the idea behind means of participation is we identify the different formats in which students could participate in class and explain them to them in advance and are transparent about them so they know. So for example, if I think wait time is important, if I don't explain to students that they should raise their hands, they might call out their answers right away in an effort to please me because they think the silence is awkward and they think I want them to shout out their answers. And as soon as they do that, then I can no longer allow for wait time because the first child who wants to will shout out an answer and then the game is lost. And so if I don't want that to happen, it's on me to communicate to students and explain to them how to participate in class, which is something that we often overlook. And so I'm going to show you this video because I think that this coach ironically does a brilliant job of explaining to his players how they should participate in the mental side of training. And I think that that's something that that teachers can borrow. And so what I'd like to encourage you to do as I show this video is just write down phrases that you could, let's say you wanted to describe to your students how you want them to participate in your class. I just think there are lots and lots of phrases here that you could borrow or adapt in a rollout for them. So this teacher's name is James Easton. And again, watch how he explains to his players how he wants them to participate in the mental side of training and write down phrases that you think you could borrow or adapt.
Okay, boys, bring it in. Stand in front, yeah. Okay, main things from tonight's session, okay? It's going to require intensity, both from a physical and a mental standpoint, okay? I'm going to be asking you questions throughout just to check for understanding. Don't shout out the answer. That's a big important thing, okay? So I want you to think about the answers that you're given, all right? If you know the answer and I go like that, raise your hand. If you don't know the answer, all right, that's okay. We'll work through it, we'll problem solve together. Sometimes I might call on you guys, even if your hand isn't raised, okay? Because the game requires you to be switched on at all times. So I'm going to be calling on guys at times to make sure the focus is still there, all right? We need to be locked in from the first minute to the last minute.
I'll just give you a second to jot down any phrases there that you liked. And then I'm just going to show you a couple minutes of him. They've now been working on the up, back, and through for 20 minutes, and this is his questioning of his students, and I think you'll find their engagement in class is quite strong.
Combination of the up, back, through. What I want you to think about now is how you can use this in the game. So from what we've just learned, how can you use this in a game? And I want you to turn and talk next to your partner. I'll give you 30 seconds, and then I'm going to be looking for answers, okay? How can you use this up, back, through in a game, and what have we learned? And time, okay. All right. Mateo, what'd you find?
Balls are striker, down to the midfield, like attacking on through.
Okay, so that's the positional aspect of it. Up to the striker, back to the midfield, and through to either a wide man or the other centre forward. What else? Quinn?
guy that's got a defender on his back, you get him to bite and then play it through.
Perfect. So you're introducing the space in behind. Okay, so you're playing up to the guy to get into that space behind. All right, for the through ball to be played in there. What else? Gary.
Play down.
All right, I'll pause there. People are already starting to put into the chat little phrases that they like, and I'd just like to let you encourage you to continue doing that. Phrases that he says or things that he does that help his players understand how to be successful participants in the mental side of training. A couple comments that are in there already. It's just him pointing out that training requires mental intensity. The game requires you to be switched on at all times. I love that, right? So in the same way that you could say chemistry requires you to be focused and to always be thinking. And so I'm going to challenge you to always be thinking. I'm going to be checking for understanding. I love that phrase. Don't call out. I want you to think. If you struggle, someone else pointing out, we'll be there to help you. Great. Just looking, and I'll just give you a second to glance at some of the other phrases that that your colleagues pointed out in this really nice video. Yes, we'll work through the answers together is a really great phrase that he is. Yes, he changes his voice tone to show that it's all right to not have the right answer. I might call on you even if your hand's not up, right? So one, be focused from beginning to end, but it makes you feel like it's not a judgment if he calls on you because he's explained to you, he's trying to prepare you for success if he cold calls. Yeah, the notion of problem solving together. So though this is soccer training, I actually think it's a beautiful example of how you can make students more successful and more engaged in class by being transparent and intentional about the ways that they should participate. And strangely, I think this is something that we overlook. In bricks and mortar classrooms, we presume that students know how to participate and we don't explain it to them. And when the results aren't great, we have to see the opportunity to re-engineer it. And so great online instruction has taught us we have to be a little bit more intentional about the means of participation and be more transparent with students about it. And I think James shows us a little bit about how that might work in the classroom. So maybe I'll pause there with just a couple of those lessons and takeaways. And I think that Michael suggested that I'd be happy to take some questions at the end. So I'll pause there and just open the floor to your thoughts, your comments, or your questions.
Thanks for that, Doug. I think everyone agree that was a brilliant sort of overview and reflections on online learning. So we really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon for us, but I think this morning for you over there. So really appreciate it. If you want to pop your hand up and I'll use come onto the mic to ask Doug a question, or you can pop it into the chat. So we've got a first question here, Doug. Someone has said, so Craig has said, what are your favorite strategies, teach like a champion or otherwise, for improving pupils' oracy?
Yeah. I think maybe this comes out slightly in some of the videos that we watched. To me, one of the most important forms of participation in the classroom is listening. I think it's the most overlooked. And so if I want students to be successful from an oracy standpoint, the first thing that I want them to do is I want them to write before they talk. Because if they write before they talk, they will have refined their ideas and they'll have better quality ideas that they can share. And it will even the playing field for students who think more deliberately and slowly, who aren't always, the most adept thinkers. Oftentimes they're really bright kids. They're just closed out because they require more deliberateness to prepare. And then the next thing that I think writing does is that it frees your working memory. So oftentimes in class, we'll call on a student and the student will make a comment. And the next student, instead of building off of that student, will say, what I wanted to say was, and that both sort of keeps the discussion from being a shared act of idea development together, and communicates subtly that the previous comment wasn't very valuable. And I don't think that students do it intentionally. I think the reason that students make that comment is because what they're thinking while the other student is talking is what I wanted to say is what I wanted to say is what I was, oh, is it my turn now? Because they're trying to keep their thought in working memory and listen at the same time. And working memory, as we know, is finite, and there's only so much you can keep in your mind at one time. So if I allow my students to write down their thoughts, then it's in front of them and they can glance at it, and then they can actually listen to one another And then I can start to build this culture of where I socialize students. When you participate, make sure you make reference to the person who went before you. Are you building off of their idea? Are you going in a different direction? Do you see another piece of evidence? Use that phrase, make some, say something that shows that you heard what they said. So we're actually learning to have productive and collaborative discussions. So to me, that process, which I think is really important, especially the listening part, starts with writing.
Thanks, Doug. That's great. And another question, which I think is quite interesting one, actually, because obviously there's a lot of techniques that you share, and I'm sure further techniques in Teach Like a Champion 3. But someone said, like, how many techniques do you believe can be successfully introduced in a single school year?
The short answer is I don't know. But the longer answer is I think it's an outstanding question, because I think the biggest risk is trying to do too many things. And so I would rather have a school or a teacher do fewer things better. I think the reason that why I don't know is because it depends on the context, and where a teacher is in their journey and how complex certain techniques are, right? I think what to do is one of the most important techniques. It's relatively simple, and I think the teachers can master it in a couple of weeks. Show call is also really important, but I think it just takes longer to master. So I wouldn't want to give you a number, but I would want to encourage you to do fewer things better, which I think is implicit in the question. When I look at great teachers, by the way, I don't see teachers who are masters of everything. I see teachers who are really good at a few things that jibe with their own personal style of teaching. And they've spent the time to really get great at them. And so I would encourage, again, fewer things better, and really getting to the point of mastery, as opposed to sort of initial competence and then kind of moving on to the next thing.
Yeah, thanks for that, Doug. And then someone has said about how do you deal with the very shy students who often struggle with speaking aloud when cold calling, and may go very red or very embarrassed when they are cold called? Is there any sort of particular way that you could help support those pupils?
Yeah, I think one of the things I love to do is let students rehearse before they're cold called. If I want them to be successful, letting them do a turn and talk before I cold call them, or letting them write for a little bit before I cold call them, I think is one successful strategy. And then let's assume that I want them to feel good about their participation, but I also should acknowledge that I may have to improve upon their comment in class. It's very rare that someone gives a perfect right answer in one go. And so I think the language that I use leading up to my cold call can communicate that. So if I said, for example, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that we think are happening during DNA recombination. Michael, would you get us started, please? Right, that phrase, get us started. First, get us started with one observation, right? That implies that no matter who participates, we're always going to improve their answer, and we're always going to develop it. And the goal is just to initiate the conversation. And then when I say, "Oh, that's very interesting," who can add to Michael's useful observation? The student can feel successful without having to have the conversation end right there. And so I think that's sort of the language with which we set students up, with which they begin. Right? Can you start us off? Can you begin to speak? Can you develop? Can you give us some initial thinking to get us started? Just lowers the threshold of expectation around the perfection of any given answer, which makes it safer for students to participate. And then finally, I think if you have a student who you really know is going to struggle, you can pre-call them and give them a little bit of a heads up and say, I'm going to come to you in a little bit. Michael, in just a minute, I'm going to ask you to open the conversation about DNA recombination. But before you do that, I want to go through a couple of things that came out of the conversation, and then I'll pass it to you, Michael. And that gives you a little bit of time to put together your thoughts and prepare your thoughts.
That's great, thanks, Doug, and that does make sense, and it sort of builds on a further question. I think you've kind of answered it, where someone's asked about, even if you give students wait time, but after 2 minutes when you ask them to sort of give their answers, you still get nothing from them. I suppose, like you say, it's that constant encouragement to participate, and hopefully over time that helps to build that relationship.
I think wait time is it's such an example of something that seems so simple, but it's so tricky to execute well. Why does this happen? Why do we give kids lots of wait time but still don't get much participation from them or a very good answer? I think there are a lot of possible reasons. One of which is, like, a very simple one is I wasn't transparent about the fact that I was going to give them a lot of wait time, so they didn't use it, right? So I say, what were some of the causes of the First World War? And then I give them 30 seconds. But while I'm thinking as a student, I don't know that you're going to give me 30 seconds. And so I'm just trying to think of something in my head that I can be ready within 5 seconds. And then I'm kind of locked in on that answer. So if I just say, this is a really challenging question, historians have debated it, I'll give you 30 seconds to think it through, right? That instantly signals to me as a student, more substantive answer. Then I think a second reason is students, it's a big assumption that students know what to do with wait time to make it productive. For example, if I gave you 30 seconds to think about what the causes of the First World War are, what would you do? And so I might say, if you're not sure, you might think back to some of the things that we've read. We read some of, we read X, we read Y. You might go back to your notes or ask yourself this question, what was the state of Europe in the years preceding? So in other words, I might socialize them to think about the tools that they might use productively during wait time, as opposed to just sitting passively staring out the window and thinking, I don't know, right? If that happened to you or I, would go and we'd flip back through the book and look for moments that would remind us. So I think there are lots of things. I think wait time is a reflection of culture, and we have to expect to build students up to their capacity to use it steadily and slowly by letting them learn how to use it well and successfully.
That's great. Thanks, Doug. Really appreciate that. And I think that we could go on all afternoon with the questions, but I am conscious of your own time, and it is coming up towards the end of the webinar. So I just want to say a big thank you again to Doug for joining us this afternoon. Some really sort of great thought-provoking reflections on what we can learn from online lessons. And I know the staff here at the King's Leadership Academy will really appreciated the ideas that you shared and the reflections you shared this afternoon. Just going to close. Tygar did have to, unfortunately, make a swift exit for an unexpected reason, but I'm just going to close by saying this is our 7th webinar as part of our participation with the EdTech Demonstrator program, DFE funded program to support schools with their online learning. And when you had your Eventbrite ticket, there was a direct link to be able to take you to the registration for interest. And if you want to get support from the demonstrator schools like ourselves, you can do so through that link. So just want to say a big thank you to Doug again, and a thanks to everyone for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely morning or afternoon or evening, depending where you are in the world. And we'll see you again. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you soon.